Was Anne of Cleves history's first ever catfish? Legend has it that Henry fell in love with Anne's flattering portrait, but when he saw her in real life, he completely rejected her. What was the real reason behind Henry's disgust? Was she really that unattractive? Or was she secretly hot, but awkward? Anne was tall with pretty blonde hair, but she's described as having a solemn face that aged her beyond her 24 years. In many ways, Anne was exactly what Henry was looking for ever since he had divorced his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Henry despised Catholicism and the Pope. Anne was a Protestant raised by John, Duke of Cleves, a prominent supporter of the Reformation who openly defied the authority of the Pope. John raised Anne to embrace Protestant values and beliefs, but it may have been her proper Protestant upbringing that doomed this royal marriage from the very start. Few people know the whole disturbing story of their courtship. For one, Henry didn't just court Anne as his bride. He also considered her younger sister, Amalia. In the late 1530s, Henry sent his court painter, Hans Holbein, on a creepy mission. Henry told Holbein to paint both Anne and Amalia, so he could decide which one he liked best. He told him to paint the girls accurately and not to flatter them, because he wanted a beautiful queen. As modest German ladies, both Anne and Amalia kept their faces covered with veils. The painter had to wheedle his way in and gain their trust before Anne and her sister finally revealed their faces. When Holbein returned, Henry saw both portraits of the women and obviously went with Anne over Amalia. As any online dater can tell you, you can't tell everything from a picture, especially not chemistry. And let's just say, when Anne walked into the room, Henry was not pleased. He immediately complained about her looks and blamed not only Holbein for glowing her up, but also his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, who had urged him to marry Anne. Henry infamously exclaimed, "She is nothing so fair as she hath been reported." Despite Henry's horrible reaction, the royal wedding was already in the works. Anne is known as Henry's rejected queen, but modern historians suggest an alternative and perhaps more plausible reason for her terrible rejection. On her way to London to meet the king, Anne's party stopped in Rochester. Suddenly, an old, burly stranger entered the room, and everything went horribly wrong. You see, this stranger was really Henry VIII in disguise. He wanted to creep in and get a sneak peek of his new bride-to-be. He expected that she would see through his costume. But when Henry approached Anne, he did not get the response he was hoping for. The young woman became alarmed about a strange dude harassing her and did not recognize the king. Henry left the encounter angry, embarrassed, and possibly ready to take revenge. If Henry disliked Anne so much, why didn't he get out while he could? He was a super powerful king of England. Surely he could snap his fingers and the wedding would be off. Well, it all goes back to the fact that Anne and Henry were a political match. There was simply no way to call the wedding off without offending his German allies. On January 6, 1540, Anne of Cleves married King Henry VIII. Now came the dreaded wedding night. On the morning after the wedding, the king reportedly complained, "I liked her before not well, but now I like her much worse." So, what actually happened? When her ladies questioned Anne, she told them, "When he comes to bed, he kisses me, and taketh me by the hand, and biddeth me, 'Good night, sweetheart,' and in the morning kisseth me, and biddeth, 'Farewell, darling.'" There is a fair chance that Anne believed these smooches were all it took to consummate the royal marriage. Henry, meanwhile, had more embarrassing complaints. He claimed that in addition to how little he was attracted to her, she also had very evil smells about her that he caught a whiff of at the most inopportune moments. And things went from bad to worse when he called Anne's virginity into question. Henry's shocking evidence? The looseness of her tokens. Henry was a poet and songwriter in his youth, so he did have a way with words. The king was desperate to get rid of Anne, so he came up with an ingenious plot. When Anne was 11, she had been briefly betrothed to another man. Her parents quickly canceled the match, but the engagement would bite her in the behind in January 1540. Henry calling someone out for having an ex? That is unbelievable! The king held a full-blown trial for his annulment from Anne, and it was an absolute three-ring circus. The king wanted to end the marriage on the grounds that they had never consummated the union. But that's not all. While Henry wanted to claim he hadn't slept with Anne, he didn't want people to think he was impotent. He hired a doctor to come in as a witness. According to the medic, His Majesty experienced 2 nocturnal pollutions, or wet dreams, even as he slept with Anne for days without consummating the marriage. In other words, the king was not impotent. It was only the marriage itself that was the problem. In the end, Henry VIII got exactly what he wanted yet again. It's a good bet Anne was pretty relieved to leave the marriage with her head still squarely on her shoulders. Henry started immediately looking for his next wife. He quickly honed in on the young Catherine Howard and married her within a few weeks of the annulment. Anne survived her term as Henry VIII's 4th wife. In public, Anne held no hard feelings about Catherine Howard replacing her on the throne and in the marriage bed. When Henry executed his 5th queen, Catherine Howard, for adultery, it was Anne who harbored a dark secret. She may have viewed the execution as less of a tragedy and more of an opportunity. Anne of Cleves held the hope of remarrying Henry and convincing him that this time she could be a good wife to him. Henry chose Catherine Parr as his 6th wife instead. Parr was an English widow who was actually a few years older than our girl. Ouch, that's gotta hurt. Still, Henry proved to be a surprisingly generous ex-husband to Anne of Cleves. Henry hooked Anne up with a severance package that included great manors, estates, and a hefty royal income. Not bad for the wife that allegedly catfished him. But that wasn't all. Henry ruled that Anne would be England's highest-ranking lady, with only the king's wife and daughters ahead of her in precedence. He even adopted her name as the king's beloved sister. Anne got along with all of Henry's children. She even sent gifts to the king's heir, Prince Edward. She was close with both Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth. Anne clearly knew where her power came from, and it paid off. Anne of Cleves was the longest surviving of Henry VIII's wives. She not only outlived his other queens, but also the king himself. On January 16, 1557, just months shy of her 42nd birthday, she passed on in her adopted country of England as Queen Mary's beloved aunt. Attendants buried Anne of Cleves in the legendary Westminster Abbey, though not in a very prominent place. Her grave reads, Anne of Cleves, Queen of England. Even more impressive, Anne of Cleves was the only one of Henry's wives to be buried in Westminster Abbey. And the rest, as they say, is history. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, subscribe to our channel.